All right, part 2 of Homesick. We're going to pick up right where we left off. I walked toward the Yangtze River, past the store that sold paper pellets that opened up into flowers when you dropped them into a glass of water. Then up the block where the beggars sat. I never saw anyone give money to a beggar. You couldn't, my father explained, or you'd be mobbed by beggars. They'd follow you every place. They'd never leave you alone. I had learned not to look at them when I passed, and yet I saw. The running sores, the twisted legs, the mangled faces. What I couldn't get over was that, like me, each one of these beggars had one life to live. It just happened that they had drawn rotten ones. Oh, Grandma, I thought, we may be far apart, but we're lucky, you and I. Do you even know how lucky? In America, do you know? This part of the city didn't actually belong to the Chinese, even though the beggars sat there, even though the upper-class Chinese lived there. A long time ago, other countries had just walked into China and divided up part of Hankow and other cities into sections or concessions, which they called their own and used their own rules for governing. We lived in a French concession on Rue de Paris. Then there was the British concession and the Japanese. The Russian and the German concessions had been officially returned to China, but the people still called them concessions. The Americans didn't have one, although, like some of the other countries, they had gunboats on the river. In case, my father said. In case what? Just in case, that's all he'd say. The concessions didn't look like the rest of China. The buildings were solemn and orderly with little plots of grass around them. Not like those in the Chinese part of the city. A jumble of rickety shops with people, vegetables, crates of quacking ducks, yard goods, bamboo baskets, and mangy dogs spilling into the streets so narrow it was hardly there. The grandest street in Hankow was the Bund, which ran along beside the Yangtze River. When I came to it after passing the beggars, I looked to my left and saw an American flag flying over the American consulate building. I was proud of the flag, and I thought maybe it was proud of me. It flapped in the breeze as if it was saying, "Ha ha," to the King of England. Then I looked to the right at the customs house, which stood on the other end of the Bund. The clock on the top of the tower said 9:30. How would I spend the day? I crossed the street to the promenade part of the Bund. When people walked there, they weren't usually going anyplace. They were just out for some air. My mother would wear her broad-brimmed beaver hat when we came, and my father would swing his cane in a jaunty way that showed how glad he was to be a man. I thought I would just sit on the bench for the morning. I would watch the customs house clock, and when it was time, I would eat the lunch I had brought along in my school bag. I was the only one sitting on a bench. People did not generally take the air on a Wednesday morning, and besides, not everyone was allowed here. The British had put up a sign on the Bund, "No dogs, no Chinese." This meant that I could never bring Lin Nai Nai with me. My father couldn't even bring his best friend, Mr. T.K. Hu. Maybe the British wanted a place where they could pretend they weren't in China, I thought. Still, there were always Chinese coolies around. In order to load and unload boats in the rivers, coolies had to cross the Bund. All day they went back and forth, bent double under their loads, sweating and chanting in a tired sing-song way that seemed to get them from one step to the next. To pass the time, I decided to recite poetry. The one good thing about Mrs. Williams was that she made us learn poems by heart, and I liked that. There was one particular poem I didn't want to forget. I looked at the Yangtze River and pretended that all the busy people in the boats were my audience. "Breathes there the man, with soul so dead," I cried, "who never to himself has said, 'This is my own, my native land.'" I was so carried away by my performance that I didn't notice the policeman until he was right in front of me. Like all policemen in the British concession, he was bushy-bearded Indian with a red turban wrapped around his head. He pointed to my school bag. "Little miss," he said, "why aren't you in school?" He was tall and mysterious-looking, more like a character in my Arabian Nights book than the man you expected to talk to. I fumbled for an answer. "I'm going on an errand," I said finally. I just sat down for a rest. I picked up my school bag and walked quickly away. When I looked around, he was back on his corner directing traffic. So now they were chasing children away too, I thought angrily. Well, I'd like to show them. Someday I'd like to walk a dog down the whole length of the Bund, a Great Dane. I'd have him on a leash like this. I put my hands out as if I was holding a leash right then, and he'd be so big and strong I'd have to strain to hold him back. I strained. Then, of course, sometimes he'd have to do his business and I'd stop, like this, right in the middle of the sidewalk and let him go to it. I was so busy with my Great Dane I was at the end of the Bund before I knew it. I let go of the leash, clapped my hands, and told my dog to go home. Then I left the Bund and the concessions and walked into the Chinese world. My mother and father and I walked here before, but not for many months. This part near the river was called the Mud Flats. Sometimes it was muddier than others, and when the river flooded, the flats disappeared underwater. Sometimes even the fishermen's huts were washed away, knocked right off their long-legged stilts and swept down the river. But today the river was fairly low and the mud had dried, so it was cracked and cakey. Most of the men who lived here were out fishing, some not far from the shore, pulling their sampans through the shallow water. Only a few people were on the flats. A man cleaning a fish on the flat rock at the water's edge, a woman spreading clothes on the dirt to dry, a few small children. But behind the huts was something I had never seen before. Even before I came close, I guessed what it was. Even then, I was excited by the strangeness of it. It was the beginnings of a boat, the skeleton of a large junk, its ribs lying bare, its backbone running straight and true down the bottom. The outline of the prow was already in place, turning up wide and snub-nosed, the way all junks did. I had never thought of boats starting from nothing, of taking on bones under their bodies. The eyes, I suppose, would be the last thing added. Then the junk would have life. The builders were not there, and I was behind the huts where no one could see me as I walked around and around, marveling. Then I climbed inside, and as I did, I knew that something wonderful was happening to me. I was a tingle, the way a magician must feel when he swallows fire, because suddenly I knew the boat was mine. No matter who really owned it, it was mine. Even if I never saw it again, it would be my junk sailing up and down the Yangtze River. My junk seeing the river sights with its two eyes, seeing them for me whenever I was there or not, whether I was there or not. Often I had tried to put the Yangtze River into a poem so I could keep it. Sometimes I tried to draw it, but nothing I did ever came close. But now that I had my junk, and somehow that gave me the river too. I thought I should put my mark on the boat, perhaps on the side of the spine, very small, a secret between the boat and me. I opened my school bag and took out my folding pen knife that I had used for sharpening pencils. Very carefully I carved the Chinese character that was our name, Gao. In China, my father was Mr. Gao, my mother was Mrs. Gao, and I was Little Miss Gao. The builders would paint right over the character, I thought, and never notice. But I would know. Always and forever, I would know. For a long time I dreamed about the boat, imagining it finished, its sails up, its eyes wide. Someday it might sail all the way down the Yangtze to Shanghai, so I told the boat what it would see along the way, because I had been there and the boat hadn't. After a while I got hungry and I ate my egg sandwich. I was in the midst of peeling an orange when all at once I had company. A small boy, not more than 4 years old, wandered around the back of the huts, saw me, and stopped still. He was wearing a ragged blue cotton jacket with a red cloth pin cushion-like charm around his neck, which was supposed to help him from getting smallpox. Sticking up straight from the middle of his head was a small pigtail, which I knew was to fool the gods and make them think he was a girl. Gods didn't bother much with girls. It was the boys that were important in China. The weather was still warm, so he wore no pants, nothing below the waist. Most mo-boys went around like this, so that when they had to go, they could just let loose and go. He walked slowly up to the boat, stared at me, and then nodded as if he'd already guessed what I was. "Foreign devil," he announced gravely. I shook my head. "No," I said in Chinese. "American friend." Through the ribs of the boat, I handed him a segment of orange. He ate it slowly, his eyes on the rest of the orange. Segment by segment, I gave it all to him. Then he wiped his hands down the front of his jacket. "Foreign devil," he repeated. "American friend," I corrected. Then I asked him about the boat. Who was building it? Where were the builders? He pointed with his chin upriver. Not here today. Back tomorrow. I knew it would only be a question of time before the boy would run off to alert the people in the huts. Foreign devil, he would cry. So I put my hand on the prow of the boat, wished it luck, and climbing out, I stared back toward the Bund. To my surprise, the boy walked beside me. When we came to the edge of the Bund, I squatted down so we were on the same eye level. Goodbye, I said. May the river god protect you. For the moment, the boy stared. Then, when he spoke, it was as if he was trying a new sound. American friend, he said slowly. When I looked back, he was still there, looking soberly toward the foreign world to which I had gone. The time, according to the customs house clock, was 2:05, which meant I couldn't go home for 2 hours. School was dismissed at 3:30, and I was home by 3:45 unless I had to stay in for talking in class. It took me about 15 minutes to write I will not talk in class 50 times, and so I often came home at 4 o'clock. I wrote up and down like the Chinese, 50 I's, 50 wills, and right through the sentence so I never had to think about what I was writing. It wasn't as if it were making a promise. Today I planned to arrive home at 4, my staying in time, in the hope that I wouldn't meet classmates on the way. Meanwhile, I wandered up and down the streets, in and out of stores. I weighed myself on the big scale in the Hankow dispensary, and I found that I was as skinny as ever. I went to the Terminus Hotel and tried out the chairs in the lounge. At first, I didn't mind wandering about like this. Half of my mind was still on the river with my junk, but as time went on, my junk began slipping away until I was alone with nothing but questions. Would my mother find out about today? How could I skip school tomorrow, and the next day, and the next? Could I get sick? Was there a kind of long lie-a-bed sickness that didn't hurt? I arrived home at 4, just as I planned, opened the door, and called out, I'm home, cheery-like and normal. But I was scarcely in the house before Lynn Nine ran to me from one side of the hall and my mother from another. Are you all right? Are you all right? Lynn Nine felt my arms as if she expected them to be broken. My mother's face was white. What happened? She asked. Then I looked through the open door into the living room and saw Mrs. Williams sitting there. She had beaten me home and asked about my absence, which of course had scared everyone. But now my mother could see that I was in one piece, and for some reason this seemed to make her mad. She took me by the hand and led me into the living room. Mrs. Williams said you weren't in school, she said. Why was that? I hung my head, the way cowards do in books. My mother dropped my hand. Jean will be in school tomorrow, she said firmly. She walked Mrs. Williams to the door. Thank you for stopping by. Mrs. Williams looked satisfied in her mean, pinched way. Well, she said, ta-ta. She always said ta-ta instead of goodbye. Chicken language, it sounded like. As soon as Mrs. Williams was gone and my mother was sitting down again, I burst into tears. Kneeling on the floor, I buried my head in her lap and poured out the whole miserable story. My mother could see that I really wasn't in one piece after all, so she listened quietly, stroking my hair as I talked, but gradually I could feel her stiffen. I knew she was remembering that she was a mother. You better go to your room, she said, and think things over. We'll talk about it after supper. I flung myself onto my bed. What was there to think? Either I went to school and got beaten up, or I quit. After supper, I explained to my mother and father how simple it was. I could stay home, and my mother could teach me the way Andrea's mother taught her. Maybe I could even go to Andrea's house and study with her. My mother shook her head. Yes, it was simple, she agreed. I could go back to British school, be sensible, and start singing about the king again. I clutched the edge of the table. Couldn't she understand? I couldn't turn back now. It was too late. So far, my father had not said a word. He was leaning back, teetering on the two hind legs of his chair, the way he always did after a meal, the way that drove my mother crazy. But he was not the type of person to keep all four legs on the floor just because someone wanted him to. He wasn't a turning back person, so I hoped maybe he would understand. As I watched him, I saw a twinkle start in his eyes, and suddenly he brought the chair down, slam, bang, flat on the floor. He got up and motioned for us to follow him into the living room. He sat down at the piano and began to pick a tune for God Save the King. A big help, I thought. Was he going to make me practice? Then he began to sing, My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty. Of course, it was the same tune. Why hadn't I thought of that? Who would know that I was singing as long as I moved my lips? I joined in now, long and strong. of the icing.